Second Kings. We're moving on from First to Second Kings. So we kind of pick up where we left off in First Kings. First and Second Kings can kind of go together. Um, if we had, if the people who put the Bible together, the canonizers, had just sort of squished them together, I don't think anybody would throw a fit about that. Um, so recall that we are in a place of divided kingdom, North and South, Israel and Judah. Hey, they split for various reasons. Go back to the previous video if you want to explore that a little bit more. And so Second Kings starts out with mostly reports. Um, this was the king in Judah. This was the king in Israel. He was good or he was bad. Usually bad. Sometimes there's room for some gray. Well, he did this, but he did that. But mostly not. Mostly it's just he was good or he was bad. Now, a bit of a interesting part of this is that it's not split out into, well, here's the book of the kings of Judah and here's the book of the kings of Israel. They're put together, kind of synchronized. So there is an implication there that from the writer's perspective, um, a long time later, that even in their division, they were still just one Israel. They were still just one group of people, still just God's people. Um, so the big event in Second Kings is the fall of the kingdoms. North and South both fall to the Assyrians, to the Babylonian Empire. So the Northern Kingdom seems to be the weakest. It kind of has that track, and most of the kings in the north are bad. It falls in 722 BC. The destruction of Samaria is in Second Kings 17. And this is important because that is the last we hear from a lot of the folks in the Northern Kingdom. What happened, we don't know. They could have been killed off totally. They could have just sort of died out. They could have spread elsewhere. We don't really know. But we do know that we get this sort of intermixing of populations of Northern Kingdom folks and Babylonians and others, which in and around Samaria. And so this is where you get this idea that in Jesus's time, that a lot of people thought of the Samaritans as half breeds because they weren't, full blooded Israelites, so to speak. And then the South falls 140 years later in 586 BC. And so then they're all kind of in waves deported to Babylon. So there's these little fights and revolts, but eventually the Assyrians went out and they're mostly deported to Babylon. They're in exile. So the last Davidic king, so the last king in the line of David in the south is Zedekiah. After Zedekiah, the age of the kings is over. You remember we started once they got into the promised land, they found their spots in Joshua and a little bit into Judges, and then in Judges they had the age of the judges, of course, um, who were not kings per se, but just people that rose up to have some kind of power for a little while and then step back. Then we had the age of the kings, and now with the exile, the age of the kings has ended. And so this deportation to Babylon or exile, you'll hear both of those things in different contexts. It's the same thing. This is sort of the hinge point for the rest of the Old Testament. So the rest of the Old Testament is you're going to finish out a little bit of history, but mostly it's going to be wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and it's going to be prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Malachi, Jonah. Um, and so the prophets and the wisdom literature are centered around kind of, or I should say, are read through the lens of where they are in relation to the exile. So the prophets are not things that are happening just after the history books. These things are all happening chronologically at the same time, even though they're later in the Bible. They're separated by theme. So first it's history, then wisdom, then prophecy. But the events they're describing are all happening at the same time. And so when you read about Isaiah or Jeremiah, they are prophesying as the exile is going on. The Psalms are being written before, during, and after the exile. The exile is that hinge point. The deportation of Babylon is that hinge point, which kind of undergirds the rest of the Old Testament. And so then a couple theological points for us to consider then. This is sort of reminiscent of previous events, right? Do you see the parallels between Egypt, where they were enslaved, and now Babylon, where they're enslaved? This is one of those history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, sort of things. They find themselves in not all that much of a different place than their ancestors were. There's this question that this theological question we call theodicy. Theodicy is this question that many of us have asked. How can bad things happen if God is God, or even if God is good, right? God promised never to abandon Israel, right? We see these promises. How do we work through this? That's a question that we get throughout the rest of the Old Testament, and the New Testament for that matter. And the answer is eventually that God was involved all the way along, even in the exile process, and sent these prophets, and they decided not to listen to the prophets. So therefore, they decided not to listen to God. And then the last theological point is this prophetic theology of history. So in Judaism, the what I've been calling the history books are not called the history books. They're called the former prophets. And then the later prophets, or the latter prophets, are the ones that I think of as prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, um, Obadiah, etc. Prophets are anyone in Judaism, especially a prophet is anyone who is God's messenger. And so we see that even these history books that seem sort of boring are God's messages. They're part of the whole story. That is Second Kings.